Hi, I'm Jennifer Siciliano, and this is The Uprising, a program where we talk about people who have questioned or come up with new ideas for the structures of society and culture. Today we have the Poor People's Campaign here to talk about, and I'll have them introduce themselves.
My name is Camille Viveiros.
And I'm Tashir Battle.
Great. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about the Poor People's Campaign and how it started and what it is?
Sure. So I work for the George Wiley Center, which has its own connection to the Poor People's Campaign. So originally, the Poor People's Campaign was agitated by groups like the National Welfare Rights Organization. Folks who aren't familiar with George Wiley, he was a Rhode Islander, actually lived in Warwick, Rhode Island, and he got involved in the civil rights movement, was a professor at Cornell, then became a full-time organizer, and then he helped found the National Welfare Rights Organization. And the National Welfare Rights Organization asked to meet with Martin Luther King to bring up the demands, things like guaranteed employment and better cash assistance. And Martin Luther King actually blew off the meeting, and the attendees from the welfare rights group were aggravated, and that was their demand, is like, well, you know, they left the meeting, and so the next meeting Martin Luther King came, and it really was an educational session, right, and part of shifting the work of the Southern Christian leadership and pushing toward including the demands of the National Welfare Rights Organization. So when I saw the anniversary coming up, I reached out to folks that on the national level that I knew that were part of the commemoration. And one of the important things that we talk about is it's not sufficient to just commemorate event, right? We want to continue it because unfortunately there's been a effort to sometimes it seems like an underhanded compliment to memorialize some of our great leaders, but then not continue the work or say that the work has been complete, right? So we're going to the Statehouse the day after Martin Luther King Day, and it's rather symbolic for us to say, you know, the work continues, right? It's not just one day.
We commemorate him, and then the next day we go on.
Yeah,
right?
and even Martin Luther King Day in itself is a good case in point. When folks know Martin Luther King is one of the best known activists known globally, and in the United States, him and Rosa Parks are, if you ask classrooms, widely known, right? But people don't know how much of a struggle it was to actually win that day, that unions put it in their contracts, that workers went out on strike, Stevie Wonder wrote a song, thousands of people wrote petitions, people did actions, right? For years and years until it was a day, right? So, we're here to invite people to continue the work because it's unfinished, right? And in coming here, I was thinking about this, and my connection to the Poor People's Campaign is through Reverend Leo Theo Harris. So there are two co-chairs. One is Reverend Barber, which people might be familiar with as one of the co-founders of the Moral Monday movement, which was an effort to push back against the disenfranchisement of people of color and the pushback of the Civil Rights Act in the South. The other co-chair is Reverend Leo Theo Harris, who I met in the mid-90s as a youth activist in the welfare rights movement, and we were part of trying to do a Freedom Summer in Philadelphia, where we tried to bring 1,000 youth together. We took over occupied housing developments with the Union of the Homeless, right? And we started this national network called Empty the Shelters, Fill the Homes. So, she went on to become a reverend and activist.
So you're saying they were squatting? Is basically,
yeah, we did.
No, I always love that idea.
Yeah.
It's like all these homes are empty.
Yeah.
And there are homeless that
Need homes.
need homes.
It's pretty,
Why are
it's
we
pretty
not
basic. And it was effective. I mean, some folks got off the waiting list. Some shelters, like Dignity West in Boston, there's a women's shelter that came out of the same action. The idea of direct action is bringing to the public the crisis at hand and taking the risks that are needed. And I think that's important for us to remind people. It's great to commemorate, but we need to continue, right? So Reverend Theo Harris's sister actually wrote a book called A More Beautiful and Terrible History, The Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History. And her name is Jean Theo Harris. And so coming here, I thought, okay, let me look over this book. And I found out some interesting and kind of disturbing things, right, about the way people have been allowed to co-opt Martin Luther King, right? So one of the facts that I found out was that in 2017, actually, Trump, when he went to the Vatican, he brought a piece of the Martin Luther King statue, a piece of granite, and also a first printing of Martin Luther King's writings, right? So we do have a struggle, not just over memory, but over what we need to have happen right now. A lot of times folks will say, okay, compare people in a neutralizing effect to say, well, this new movement or this new effort isn't like the old one, right? And we need to inoculate and challenge that by making sure we're intergenerational and that we're open to criticism, but we also don't allow for people who haven't been outspoken about social injustice and racism to say, no, the civil rights movement had its place and that's over. We know that's not true.
That's terrible. Yeah,
right?
yeah, right.
So in Rhode Island, some of the facts are that like 41% of people in Rhode Island are poor or low income. So a total of 428,000 residents. So this includes 49% of children, 42% women, and 65% of people of color. So, these issues, there's this idea that, okay, let's commemorate something and everything is fine now, or the idea that, Martin Luther King was popular and well liked, and we know it was controversial, right? And so we want to challenge ourselves and others to join us. We'll be there the day after Martin Luther King Day on January 22nd.
At the State House.
At the State House. We're meeting at the library at 2:30, and we're going to deliver the demands of the Poor People's Campaign. And I want to thank Reverend Ebony, who was co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign in Rhode Island. And we were, co-chairs. She came out of it more through knowing Reverend Barber, me through Reverend Theo Harris. And now we're at a point of growing and kind of localizing our struggle. And I'm so happy that we've kind of organized, and we have an organizing committee now, which is really what we need to be able to organize statewide. So we have, and we're welcoming people to join that committee.
Okay.
And we're doing things like planning, canvassing, and outreach, really localizing our local issues rooted in the demands of the larger Poor People's Campaign.
Okay, so let me take a step back. So Martin Luther King, he got the civil rights passed with Lyndon Johnson, and then the next thing he was doing is
Poor People's Campaign.
Yep,
before
and then
his
he was
assassination.
assassinated.
Exactly.
And there was a march? Was it for the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C.? And is that the anniversary that you're talking about? And when was that, 1967, 8?
Yeah, so last year was the anniversary of both, Martin Luther King's assassination and the Poor People's Campaign march, which had Resurrection City. It had a kind of a tent city. There were caravans from throughout the country that came together. It was very multicultural, international. The organizers, from those organizing meetings with Martin Luther King, they decided to reach out to all poor people, right, and develop an interracial movement. And so that's really what the Poor People's Campaign represented at that moment. And we're actually, if people join us on Tuesday, or we're bringing back some of the songs from the original Poor People's Campaign.
Wow.
And we see, the culture work is important. Sometimes folks are overwhelmed by the news or following certain people's tweets, right?
Yes.
And we need to bring back the culture that we can sustain a long time struggle and build a community. So it's, yes, about the next election, but beyond that too.
Mm-hmm. Shahir, how did you get involved with the Poor People's Campaign?
I got involved by seeing the Facebook posts, and then I'm like, okay. I've worked with the homeless for about 18 years here in Rhode Island and also in Mass. And so seeing the struggles of the homeless, I figured this is somewhere I need to be. This is something I need to get involved with. So I got involved. I actually came to one of Camille's orientations, and then I took it from there. So I was part of the Moral Mondays, consistently there, supporting the cause.
And I remember last summer, is that part of the Moral Mondays
Yes.
that you were getting together? Are you going to do that again this coming summer, or what are your plans?
So right now, it looks like in terms of the organizing committee, we're trying to kind of brainstorm what our next steps are. So more to come. Hopefully we can have some more Moral Mondays, but we're just organizing right now.
Yeah. So you previously you explained to me there are like 4 different groups, or I don't know what you want to call them, like subgroups of what you're trying to support and push.
In terms of agendas?
Yeah, agendas. Thank you.
Well, I mean, there are different. I think that one thing that I kind of want is we can march, and I've talked to a lot of people about the marches that go on for different causes, but at the end of the day, there also needs to be policy changes. So I would like to see, yes, we're marching, but we're also affecting policy at the local level, and the national level. I mean, the national campaign's doing their thing, but more like policy development on how to address these issues.
What would you like to see? A policy change? Give me one, like what is the most important policy change here in Rhode Island? There's so many probably, but well, just give me a few then, so you don't feel like this is the most important.
I mean, one of the things that we're trying to strike a balance between are the existing policies at the State House, and what we're trying to do that's unique is bring together people in kind of an intersectional analysis. So folks that recognize that ecological devastation is an issue that we have to grapple with, and systematic poverty and white supremacy and the distorted moral narrative, right, which is interesting. In the North, right, we hear morality, it might have a different tone, and part of that is taking a page from the Moral Mondays movement, where people think morality has been hijacked by white supremacists, by folks that think it means you have to be a certain faith, right? By anti-LGBT ideas, by condemning and blaming the victim. So looking at morality being about politics of respectability, and saying, well, so across every social issue, there's this narrative that blames the victim, makes the issue individualizes it, right? And so what that means to us is like switching that around. So we know we need to change not just the narrative, but the narrator. And that's going to mean face-to-face organizing. And that's what we're doing, right? We're going to go up to the State House. We're going to educate our legislators about those main pillars that we're focused on. That is relatively unique, bringing together folks that, yes, we recognize these issues as all important and interconnected. And we also know that we need to organize more directly affected folks. So we have groups like the George Wiley Center, Direct Action for Rights and Equality, and we have a lot of leaders that are doing work in the community, but we're still networking to figure out, okay, like how do we speak to folks like for example, last night we had a meeting and we talked about doing a survey, like how do we create tools for participation and feedback, because this has to.
It's hard to get everybody involved. Right. If we all know about hierarchy structures. Usually it's the boss telling the people what to do, but when we don't have as many tools, or we're not as familiar with the tools from ground up. But this is the reason why I had you come on, because to me, I keep seeing laws against panhandling and this whole idea that there's something wrong with being poor. And I don't know where that started. Maybe these books talk about that, but I thought it was a Christian thing. This is not a Christian show, but that you're supposed to love your neighbor, you're supposed to love people. And this whole idea of, well, I don't want to see the poor people, or in Kennedy Plaza, let's get, I don't even want to say the words like that they use, as though these people were different than them, and bad. And I think that that's absolutely ridiculous. And that's where I see that the movement is. It's like, no, that's not right.
Right. So basically, what we're saying is certain things are a fundamental right. To have decent housing, to be able to make a living wage, and to support your family on that. And what we're seeing basically with the panhandling or banning that is criminalizing the poor. So I mean, they talk about mass incarceration, but if you're criminalizing the poor, you create a revolving door. And ultimately, to me, it's a bigger issue when it's corporations behind it too. So I have a problem with that. Yes. I'm just thinking of loitering and vagrancy and stuff like this. It's like, I'm like, so loitering, it's illegal to just hang around somewhere. I'm like, how did they even think that that was an okay thing to chart? Because we're all humans. It's more important to appreciate our humanity than you can't be here in a certain spot. Well, if you're privileged and you haven't walked in the person's shoes, then you're kind of not going to be, you're probably not going to be like understanding of their plight. So it's like, unless you walked in someone's shoes, and you can't really understand. So you're like, those people over there need to be off the corner. But if you're living in an upscale neighborhood and you didn't have to deal with that, then you really probably don't care because it doesn't affect you. So it's a hard thing to change. Yeah. I mean, it's really called empathy, and it's hard. It's hard.
And we're talking about like systems, right? Like systems and structures, right? So like white supremacy, and how people are blaming each other, even poor people, right? Even working class people, failing the idea that I'm legitimate, I deserve these because I've worked, or this is the first time, like I hear that a lot, this is the first time this has happened to me. And rather than looking at like long time unemployment, discrimination, white supremacy, right? And it's structured, and unfortunately it's we can't just celebrate Martin Luther King Day and then the day after go back to business as usual, because this has been a theme of U.S. history, and it's divide and conquer, and having low-income people, poor people, working class people blaming each other, and our decision makers are laughing all the way to the bank, right? Yep. So we need to build the power of the people. We need to build those relationships. And we're part of the solution. We recognize that we have to build trust in rank and file, in our communities, and yes, we need to pick issues, but we also need to identify them on a personal level and build a movement. I mean, we can't solve these issues. It's not going to work if we just knock on doors at the Statehouse without doing the organizing in our communities. So that's what we're at. We're not like, okay, 50 years is a year after, done, let's just, no. This is a lifetime struggle.
Yeah, I know, for both of you both.
Right.
That's what you.
Yeah, it's about empowering people to speak for themselves and for their rights. Personally, I would like to see more, Democracy RI, I believe, started the co-op and got the legislation passed. So I would like to see more people developing their own businesses to empower them, and people using those businesses locally rather than big businesses. So in my mind, this would be my ideal goal for this campaign, or for at least my, what are the goals I would like to see happen. So.
Yeah. I mean, the statistics, if people say the system, they don't see it, maybe. But if you look at the statistics, why are more poor people of color? Why is that? Because there's a system in place.
Right.
So I think a lot of people maybe don't. And I was actually talking to somebody yesterday, and they're a working person, and we were talking about wealthy people getting tax credits, and they were saying, that's ridiculous. And then she started talking about, there's people that get food stamps and they live better than I do. And I was like,
Really?
Really? I mean, that's the split.
Right.
Just to start blaming being angry at those people when it's not those people. They're not living
Right.
an amazing. You should be angry at the first person you were talking about was the wealthy people, and.
Yeah, I mean, we need to have economic education and fiscal education. The opposite of what that often is perceived, right? Often that is blaming somebody for their minute personal choices with a finite budget, right?
Yeah.
So like members of the George Wiley Center, I mean, just last night, someone was talking about like, trying to live on $700 a month, right? And we have a budget there where we have people fill out their budget, but it isn't to blame them for the choices.
Right.
It's to explain, like, this is how much I have in my budget, and this is why I couldn't pay the bill this month, and this is why we need policy reform to make things more affordable. And, but if we're isolated, right, then everyone can think, I'm trying hard, but I don't know that person beside me. Like, who knows what I pay my bills, right? And it's the same, I mean, George Wiley, that's what he did with women that were leaders in the civil rights movement. There was shame around welfare, and there still is, and there's less welfare now than before. So, but there was shame, and they took a stigma where people were embarrassed to say they were welfare and recipients, and turned it into a point of action where people talked about being parents and what it meant to sacrifice and try to survive on limited budget, and then took action, right? And so within 3 years of taking action, they worked with sociologists, but most importantly, the welfare recipients themselves took actions and took over welfare departments and offices and demanded justice, and they doubled the size of cash assistance, right? So, appealing to people's moral consciousness, we need to educate, some politicians, legislators, maybe they'll change their mind, but we've never relied on just, dreaming, right? That's what people think. Martin Luther King, okay, the dreams, well, he organized with thousands of other people.
Yeah.
So we need to organize, and we also need to not allow for people to make the civil rights movement turn folks into ghosts that are going to haunt us now for imaginative mythologies, right?
Like
where
this
people
whole
are saying,
idea.
you don't behave
It's done already.
Right.
It's done, and you're not.
there's no way near.
It's just put on a suit and don't ever, like, the idea that this was a trope out there that, like, Martin Luther King would never take over a highway. He did take over many highways, right?
Exactly.
So we
Is
get
that
in
what
it.
Selma?
Yeah. So like tactically, like they blame us whenever we try to do tactics, and it was less than. It was like the 20% of people approved of Martin Luther King when he was alive, and now it's like double that, right?
Yes.
And so, it's not like we want to intentionally be controversial, but we want people to really look around, right, and analyze and talk to people and really talk to your neighbors, right? Like, we're at a moment right now, they're talking about the economy being so great. I know folks that are still struggling from the recession in 2008.
Yeah, and I mean, and with the shutdown, I mean, you're going to see a lot more people affected if they can't get, their benefits
It's going to be awful.
Food stamps reinstated, Section 8 renewals and so forth. So you can, if things don't change and it's still shut down, you can see people maybe having to negotiate with their landlords just to stay in housing, even if it's, if they can't pay it because their Section 8 is not renewed. So it's going to affect a lot of people. And I try to tell my kids that and go, we don't know what you're talking about, but I'm like, it's going to affect a lot of people.
Yeah, it's not just those, it's like families
Exactly.
and other people.
Veterans that served this country,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So, I mean.
Yeah, people are afraid. Like at this meeting last night, folks were coming in that rely on affordable housing, and it's already impacted SNAP assistance, and people are afraid. And
yeah, I don't know if people know, but they got the state gave the SNAP assistance early
on the 20th.
On the 20th for February, hoping that
Everything
they can
will,
budget.
Yep.
So people can budget in February, and that's going to be, so at the end of February, it's probably going to be pretty tough
Right.
for people.
Yeah.
Because like food stamps probably aren't near enough, which I think is absolutely ridiculous because literally you are buying food. What a right, everyone should be able
Right.
to have
Absolutely.
food. It's like not,
Right.
I don't know why it's a question of whether you
Yeah,
have food or not.
And it's unfair to people that depend on these benefits. I mean, you have someone that's basically shutting down the government and saying, I'm not going to budge, but not thinking about the effects on his own workers and everybody else that relies on benefits. So
It makes me sad.
yeah, I mean, like what you were saying about the just doing unto your neighbor, right? I mean, that's like a core. It's considered the golden rule, right? But it gets distorted when there's a lot of media out there and like affluent folks that benefit from us being divided. It's not a conspiracy theory, it's reality, right? When people are like reading and there's Facebook ads that are very polarizing toward the poor and different racial groups, and and then folks are skeptical, right, of going to the State House, taking action in their ability to make change. And so what we need to do and what we're doing is around this change in the narrator is saying, well, what are our values, right? Like how do we build a community of solidarity, of support, and action to call out when folks that are supposed to be our representatives are like not in sync with our values, right? And we're going to continue to hear, okay, well, people taking advantage of the system, and and how I respond to that is like, well, let's look at, for example, with National Grid and George Wiley Center, that's a common trope. It's like, oh, well, I pay my bills. Well, who's making the billions of dollars in this situation? Who is deciding how much you pay on your bill? That's what we need to change, is coming together and reforming those laws to help people be able to survive, right? And that's going to take us building trust and building community and getting to know each other, because I do believe, like, yeah, most people are good, but we can't shy away from these issues any longer. We have to talk about the role of these systems: systematic poverty, white supremacy, ecological devastation, the war economy, because they're all connected. And our funding is so bloated for the war economy and militarism. And then, folks are going to say, well, we can't afford to help the poor, right? Or we can't afford to do the right thing around climate change.
Well,
so we can't be divided anymore.
Yeah, there's money out there. There is. So is there any last minute things you want to, well, actually, we probably need to wrap up. So I don't know.
Well, please follow us on Facebook, Rhode Island Poor People's Campaign. Most of our events there, and if you want to send us a message, we'll get you connected regionally to some of our organizing efforts. And thank you so much for the time.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you so much for coming.
This is when we're
This is when we talk?
talking.
No,
And that
I
we're-
think we've got a few more minutes. No, we don't have a few more minutes. We can be, yeah,
Wrap it
okay. Thanks.